Hello everyone, my name is Victor and I'd like to welcome you to this quick introduction of my geometry node based Moss generator, which I creatively named Mossifier. Here I built an example scene with polyhaven.com assets, a great platform by the way, to show you how Mossifier can transform your scene. Before taking a look at the details in our Blender scene, here a small overview. Mossifier is a fully procedural geometry node setup in combination with a shader function, and when creating it, it was important for me to have something that not only works from a distance but also from a close-up. That's why the shader function is using 4K textures, and the meshes itself that are being generated actually look like tiny moss strands. As I will show you in a bit, it is fully customizable. You can change the color, the way it grows, and the shape of the meshes, all inside one modifier. Alright, now let's jump right into it. We have here the concrete cat from the previous renderings. And about now, the first step would obviously be to import Mossifier into our scene. And the way I would do it is go to File, Append. I have the Mossifier blend file on my desktop, select it, and then it will show you the content of your Blender file. Go to Node Trees and select the 3 node trees that are in there. And now if we create a geometry nodes modifier, we can select Mossifier. And you can also see already there that something's happening. So step 1 is done. Let's continue with step 2. Let's open the shader editor. This is the basic shader of the concrete cat, and we want to plug in our Mossifier shader right afterwards. So search for MG, material groups, and then it's the Mossifier material, just like that. And you will also see now that something's already happening as well, that we get some greenish areas. And the third and last step would be create another slot on your object, select the Mossifier Moss. This is the material for the actual instances that are being generated on your mesh, and in there is a texture coordinate node where you need to assign one object. I recommend to assign the actual object you're using to generate it on, but if you have a bigger scene, it can also be like some helpers, some empty. This is for generating some UV coordinates for some noise textures. Alright, now with our setup done, let's start exploring Mossifier. We go to our geometry nodes window, and as you can see, there are quite a few parameters. Don't let it scare you. We'll go step by step. First with those 3 ones here, the mesh density, mesh scale and mesh length. The names are self-explanatory. Mesh scale is the scaling of our actual 3D mesh, our moss strands, as you can see here. So making this bigger will even show you a bigger mesh. Mesh length is the length of those strands. So if we give it like something at 3, you can see that they're getting longer. And this is, for example, if you have some moss in a very humid with a warm climate area, then the moss strands can get very long. On the other hand, if you have a rock in some park in Europe, it will usually be a bit shorter. So then this is how you can determine what type of moss you have. And the mesh density is obviously how many of these instances will be spawned on your object. And as you have noticed, having a small mesh density, we don't see the texture below because there is also a material density parameter, which you need to, for example, to increase like this. The material density is being also controlled by the mesh density, plus the material density, this parameter works on top of the mesh density. So for example, let's move this back and scale our meshes back. You can see that there is like a few instances spawned and we can see through the concrete. And now if we increase the density, we are also getting the material back. So this is like, it is controlling the density just in a very slow, it's blending it on top. And for example, out of performance reasons, you want to have less instances, but you still want to see the material below. This is what the material density parameter is for. So for example, like this. Now you have your moss material plus some meshes, for example, for some video games or something like this. But you don't have to actually to spawn like thousands of instances. And you can just have something like this, like a middle way. This is about the main parameters. So let's just increase our density maybe to 2. That's good to go. Now let's talk about the generation of how the moss is being generated on top of our object. And by default it is taking all the faces that are facing upwards and is spawning the moss on those, as you can see here. There are other ways, and one of them is the growth controller. This one basically requires a second object, so let's create some empty and move it somewhere here. And the growth controller, basically you have to first check the box to use it and then assign it. The growth controller determines the direction in which the moss is growing. So as you can see here, now I'm moving my growth controller and the moss is following it. The same also works for the Z height. As you can see now, we can have some moss underneath it. And this way the moss behaves more realistically, because moss depends always on the direction of the sun. So for example, if we have our sun facing our object from the back like this, let's make it a bit stronger, then the moss would grow more in the shadow side, because it does not like strong hot sun, like afternoon sun. So it usually is growing in the other side, on the other side of the sun. So this way you can have, for example, also a global controller, since sun is also something, since the direction of the sun is also a global value, and you have a, for example, your forest scene, you can assign this growth controller to all of your objects, and then your moss will grow in all the correct direction of your controller. Now let's continue here. Additionally to the growth controller, or also if you're not using any controller, you can enable some noise. And this is basically just multiplying a noise with your normal, with the previous generation, so either be it Z value or the direction of your controller, and then it kind of breaks up the homogeneity of your moss, so you have some in between to give it a bit more of the chaotic nature that our world actually is. And of course you also have a noise distortion to have some different values. And since we're now talking about the noises, we also have the Z value here, so you can switch between different randomness, and this Z value is also being used for the generation of the instances, every noise that is being used. So just by switching through this, you get different options. The next step, or another option, is to use weight paint. So weight paint in this case means that you can erase unnecessary moss that you don't like. For example, you have generated yourself something like this, but you would like to keep the face clean. So we can use the weight paint. First let's create a vertex group, go back to our modifier, and then you can assign the group in here. And now if we switch to weight paint, basically everywhere where it's 1, the moss is not being generated. As you can see here, it is disappearing. And then you can, for example, control more or less some of the areas that you don't want to have the moss on. This only works for erasing, so basically this one is multiplying as well everything that comes before, and you don't need to use the noise to enable the weight paint, and you also don't need to use the controller to enable the weight paint. They work independent from each other. And let's continue with the use texture. The use texture parameter is disabling the previous one, so if you set the checkbox here, the weight paint, the noise and the controller, as well as the default upwards facing method, will be turned off, and you can assign a texture in here, like a mask. So let's import a texture. Let's go for something like a checker. This is easy visible. And then you can select it here. Plus you need to define the UV map in here. So let's take the UV map. And now we can see that our moss is being spawned on our checker mask. Now we can also talk about the subdivision parameter. Since we are working in geometry nodes, every information is coming from the faces and the vertices. So if you have a lower resolution, like a lower density on your object, you will have more blurry interpretation of textures, for example, also of noises. And if you increase the subdivisions, you can see how the texture gets sharper, because now there are actually more vertices to interpolate the values better. So this is just something if you need it, or if you have a low resolution mesh and you want to have a crisper looking outcome. Let's go back. And the use texture is basically you have a cavity map or anything that you have baked somewhere, for example in Substance Painter. You can just solve all of these with one texture. Alright, this was it about the generation methods. Now let's take a look at the clumping next. The clumping is trying to simulate the behavior of moss, how it grows in tiny islands, that you have like small areas forming, then you have another small area forming around it, and there are usually tiny gaps in between those. And maybe if we make our meshes smaller, these clumps are here, these dark areas. So this is again another noise, and the dark lines are the separations of those tiny islands. So we need to increase this maybe to something like 100 to see it better. And then again, as I was saying with the noises and the subdivisions, maybe you need to have a higher subdivision to get more detailed noise. Yeah, now we have our clumping. Then we can also displace the area of the moss into the normal direction of our object in these brighter areas. So let's increase this. And you can see here now already, if we maybe also switch to some light, that we are having some tiny islands forming where the noise is. So if we also increase it higher, you can see them more extreme. Of course they will now distort your mesh as well, but this gives us this moss-like growth that is not a flat carpet but having also some structure, and it works well for flat surfaces. And now let's put our mesh back. I would be careful with this one. As you can see, it can distort your mesh quite a bit, especially like in these areas, so maybe keep it like at a 1, or if you don't have a fully flat surface, maybe you don't need it at all. Now let's take a look at the colors. This is basically the rest of the colors. We have, let's make less meshes, make them bigger so we can visualize it better. For example here, this moss strand here, bot to top gradient on each strand. So we have our bot color. As you can see here, it's the bottom of our moss, and we have our top color. And furthermore, this is why we had this texture coordinate node in the moss before. There is a noise being applied on top of the meshes to give it some variation, as you can see here. So it's not to make it fully uniformly colored, there is the mesh variation color. There is also option to control the subsurface scattering intensity, and that one, for example, if you need to have more, you can increase it higher. Depends also on your lighting. Maybe let's turn off the texture and maybe put it back to 1. Like right now we don't see as much subsurface scattering, and if you increase it, you can slowly see how it is being made stronger. And I think it works even better in cycles. So maybe now we have our sun coming from here, you can see already here that there is something happening, and just to make it stronger you can increase it slowly here to have the actual subsurface scattering effect. Maybe something like this. Now let's continue with the material scale. The material scale is basically what you have below the moss, beneath the moss. So right now it's a bit tiny, so scaling this down will increase the size of the textures, and you can see now that there is slowly some moss happening. If I decrease the scale of our meshes, you can see here just a simple moss texture, and it's advisable to have this more or less the same scaling as your actual geometry, because then it blends better together, and then you don't need to have as many actual moss strands as geometry, but you can also fake some with the texture itself. And just like the mesh itself, you can also control the colors of the texture. We have color A, we have color B, so then maybe you need to increase the values here to see it properly. There's also color C, which is again a global noise. And then about the clumping, the tiny islands, those gaps in between, this is the last color, as you can see here. This is the color of the gaps between the individual moss islands. That was it for the introduction. Thank you for your time. I hope this video sparked your interest and was helpful. If you're interested, you can purchase Mossifier with the link down in the video description. And if you do purchase it, thank you very much for your support. Also, feel free to provide me feedback on the product. See you guys next time, and take care everyone.